Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. Today we're going to be covering the visual elements, and just a little bit of a heads up, we're going to be covering a lot of very basic information today, so please bear with me. It's stuff that we have to cover, but it's fairly basic, so we're going to go fairly quickly through it just to get through it. So, that being said, jumping in. Before we can really start to talk about the visual elements, we have to know how the visual elements might be arranged, and that would be in two-dimensional or three-dimensional format. So, when we're referring to something that has two dimensions, this would be referring to the plane or the picture surface, or an object that is encompassed by length plus width. Whereas three-dimensional objects or artworks are when the visual elements are aligned within 360 degrees. So once again, basically speaking, it would be the difference between a drawing or a painting on a flat surface versus, say, a sculpture or an architectural building, etc., etc. But just a quick little, diagram of that. Something that has zero dimensions would be something like a point. It does not encompass length or width or anything like that. Whereas with an object being one dimension would be something like a line. So a line is dominated by length, basically. Now, if we then take the line and extend it by the width, we then get a two-dimensional object. And then if we extend it into space, we get a three-dimensional object. We can go even further if we start to play with our perception of time, time being the fourth dimension. And this is much more of an element that's dealt with in things like film and theater production and stuff like that. So for our purposes, we really only get into about the third dimension. However, we will see a little bit about how artists might deal with things like time in a two or three dimensional kind of setting. So, from there, our visual elements are as follows: line, shape, mass, space, time, motion, light, color, and texture. And we'll be looking at examples of each of these today. So, we begin with line. And in its most basic sense, line is the connection of 2 points in space or an extension of a point. Our basic means of recording and symbolizing ideas, observations, and feelings. So, a line, very, very rudimentary, very basic. But the line is the birthplace of almost all art forms. It's the birthplace of drawing, of writing, of sculpture for the most part, etc., etc., etc. So it's a very, very common, very ubiquitous aspect within the world of art making. Now, it is important to note that there are different kinds of line, though. So, in most of our perceptions, when we think of line, we're probably going to think of pure geometric line, and that exists only in one dimension and not in the 3D world. So, pure geometric lines lack height and depth and are forms in which length dominates width. So, a pure geometric line, if I was to draw a line on a piece of paper, that would be purely geometric versus, say, the line created by the edge of the desk here. Once again, this would not be purely geometric, only something that we drew on paper that only existed in two dimensions would be considered pure. So, edges, in that regard, can be perceived as lines where objects in space collide, such as the line on the desk here. However, this is still not purely geometric. So, lines can also be considered paths of action, as which act to draw the attention of the eye, and so we'll see how that plays out in a lot of artwork throughout the semester as well. So, a line, for instance, can draw our attention across a picture plane or through it, or in all kinds of different things, in different ways. So, we'll see examples of that a little bit later on as well. Now, from there, lines can also be active or static. So they can, indicate direction, or they can indicate a static, stopping point. They can be aggressive and, very action oriented, or passive, rather curvilinear. And similarly, sensual or mechanical. This would also be the difference between, hard angled edges versus soft curving forms, things like this. But lines can be used to indicate things like direction. So we can use line to indicate that in the directions a figure might be moving within a two-dimensional artwork, things like that. They can be used to define borders or boundaries between not only shapes but also space. They can also imply things like volume and solid mass. So we can use them to illusionistically recreate solid matter and things like that within the two-dimensional realm. But they can also be used to suggest things like emotion or motion in general. So we can have lines that begin to imply a certain sense of emotion or general feeling, whereas we can also have lines that begin to suggest motion within the picture plane as well. So, lines can be grouped together to depict things like light and shadow, mass, pattern, and even textures. So here we have a nice example of what's known as cross-hatching. So we use parallel lines at varying angles and layer them up against one another until we get the idea of shading or, shadow out of it. And so this is something that we can do quite extensively to recreate the illusion of realistic or representational subject matter within a two-dimensional artwork. And so here we can see an example of that. So the artist here is using, very simple, cross-hatching parallel lines and layering them up at varying degrees and at different angles to create the illusion of three-dimensional forms on the two-dimensional surface here. Now, likewise, we can be much more, complicated than our simple geometric shapes, which we see here. And we can even use this line and cross-hatching method to begin to imply physicality and texture and things like that, such as we see here with this group of pillows by Albrecht Dürer. So we can see that he's using just minimal lines and layering them at differing angles to create the illusion that this fabric is twisted and contorted around itself. Now, likewise, we can also have implied lines. And an implied line is a line which suggests visual connections or that draws the eye throughout a work of art. And this is something that artists have done for a long, long time to help create a sense of drama or a sense of, energy within a work of art, because if all of our attention was solely focused on one area, it would become very static and very boring. So in here we see an example by Guido Reni with a kind of overlay of the implied lines onto the figure of Saint Sebastian here. And so if we could imagine if all of our, if Saint Sebastian was the only thing in this image and his torso was down here dead center, all of our attention would be right there dead center, and we wouldn't have any reason to really interact with any of the rest of the canvas. Instead, though, Guido Reni has aligned the angles of the form to echo this movement of our eye throughout the canvas. So if we see here, our eye would be meant to kind of take this zigzag curve throughout. And so these implied lines, which obviously are not exactly there without the overlay, help to draw our attention as the viewer away from just the dead center and instead interact with all parts of the image itself. And so this is something that many, many artists do and have done for long, long periods of time. And we'll see some more examples of this next time as well. So aside from line, we also have shape. And shape refers to the expanse within the outline of a two-dimensional area or within the outer boundaries of a three-dimensional object. So shape, mass, and form are often used interchangeably, even though mass and form also have their own kinds of connotations about them. So sometimes you will hear the three used interchangeably. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, Once again, there are, like line, many different kinds of shape. So our most basic forms would be our pure geometric shapes, such as circles, triangles, squares, rectangles, and polygons. And then we also have all of the 3D counterparts to those. So spheres, cylinders, cubes, cones, etc., etc. So pretty basic there. However, we do also have much more complicated and interesting kinds of shapes. One such would be organic shapes. And these are irregular, often curving or rounded forms that are often more relaxed and informal than their geometric counterparts. So here we can see a nice diagram of this. Here we have an actual leaf, and then we have an organic shape here in the form of the kind of teardrop. And once again, it does have a harsh angle, but for the most part, it's much more curvilinear. So organic shapes tend to be very curvilinear in origin. Now, next to it, we also have an example of our next form of shape, and that would be biomorphic shape. And so biomorphic shapes refer to shapes based on natural living forms. So once again, just to go back, here we can have the organic shape based on the biomorphic shape of the leaf. So organic, biomorphic. But there are artists that deal with biomorphic shape, such as Jean Miro here, very famous advocate for biomorphic shape. But here we can see his allegory for painting. So this is an allegory for the actual act of painting. And we can perhaps pick out, the self-portrait of the artist right here in yellow. Once again, it's not exactly realistic or representational. It is fairly abstract, but these shapes begin to imply the biomorphic quality of the human being. And likewise, we also have some other, shapes that are reminiscent of faces and figures there. This would be meant to be the artist's easel and his canvas, these kinds of things. But once again, biomorphic shapes tend to mimic natural living forms. Now, aside from that, we also have what we call the picture plane, and that is the flat picture surface itself. So our piece of paper, our canvas, our panel, whatever, what have you. But within the picture plane, we usually have two forms of shapes, and these would be positive and negative shapes. Now, the positive shape or figures that are figures that are dominant forms on the picture plane. So this is usually whatever the main focus of the artwork is, anything that might be in the foreground. Whereas negative shapes or the ground refers to the background areas of the picture plane or areas of subordination that help to create emphasis on the main subject matter. And what's interesting is that our recognition of positive and negative shape can be reversed depending on what we're looking for or at. And so here we have a very simple diagram. I'm sure most of you have seen something like this before. However, depending on which of these we're looking at, we're perhaps going to see a different positive shape. So for instance, in the diagram on the left here, the positive shape would be the silhouette of the human form because the black form is much more dominant here. And likewise, on the left, we can see the form of the vase coming out. And once again, this would be a recognition of the role reversal between positive and negative shape. And so sometimes artists play this up. Not a lot of artists really deal with this. It's usually much more subtle than this kind of example. But there are some, such as M.C. Escher, who really play up this whole idea. And so this whole idea refers to what's known as the figure-ground relationship or the figure-ground reversal. And so figure-ground refers to the relationship between these positive and negative shapes, whereas the figure-ground reversal refers to the process whereby our awareness of positive and negative shapes shifts place. And so here we can see an example of that in an artwork by M.C. Escher. This is what he refers to as tessellation. But we can see that the positive shape of the goose on the top morphs into the negative shape of the water on the bottom, and vice versa with the fish to the sky here. And so once again, the recognition of this figure ground reversal is being illusionistically made here in these kind of middle passages between the kind of duck and the fish as we go down. So kind of interesting. MC Escher does quite a bit of work along these lines, but it is fairly rare. It's not something that many artists deal with so wholeheartedly. Now, aside from that, also in terms of shape, we can also talk about mass, which is the physical bulk of a solid body material, also referred to as form. Mass is usually going to refer to something in the 3 dimensions or the 3rd dimension. So 2D area is called shape, whereas 3D area is called mass. So that's the major difference. Whereas volume refers to when mass encompasses space. So mass and volume are major elements in things like sculpture and architecture. However, we can create the illusion of mass in a 2D area or arena. However, something only has volume if it physically exists in reality. So if I had a sculpture here in front of you, that would have volume, whereas just the image, on the flat computer screen would have the illusion of mass, per se. Now, aside from that, we also have different kinds of form, and this usually, once again, almost exclusively applies to sculpture. But our first would be what's known as a closed form, and this is when mass that doesn't interact with the surrounding space is utilized. So most sculpture that we've ever seen or that you've ever seen is going to be considered a closed form. Think about the Augusta Suprema Porta, which we saw last time, or the image of Tete here, which we see by Joseph Sickey. But the idea of this being closed is that we cannot interact with the interior of the actual form. It's closed off to us. We can only interact with it in 360 degrees around it, but we cannot interact through it. That is opposed to, say, an open form, which refers to a mass that interacts with its surrounding space. And so here we can see Henry Moore's double oval. And so this would be considered an open form, not only because of the actual holes in the forms themselves, but we could interact by going all through and around them, through the holes in the center, all of these kinds of things. But this open area of the sculpture opens the sculpture up to the surrounding space and makes it part of its environment, rather than being just a closed off kind of form. So important distinction there. Now, when we're referring to space, however, we're referring to the indefinable general receptacle of all things, the seemingly emptiness around us. So once again, fairly basic, but space is a major element in certain types of artwork, especially installation sculpture and environmental sculpture, things like that, such as Chris Burden's Extreme Measures installation, which we see here. So we can see that there are a bunch of these small wooden forms that are all suspended by individual strands of fishing wire here, but it creates space in and amongst each one of those forms. And even though the gallery or whatnot would not like us to go through them, we could interact in and go in between all of those different forms if we wanted to. But that's something you shouldn't just do in that kind of setting unless it's part of the artwork itself. But a lot of these kinds of installations make great use of space. They usually see the space as being part of the artwork, and they also tend to see the viewer's interaction with that art and that space as being part of the art as well. So it's always kind of interesting. Now, what I find interesting is that almost all artwork begins to imply space of some kind. However, it's not always as illusionistically realistic or representative as we might tend to think. So here we have a nice example of some of the earliest artwork to start to delineate space within the two-dimensional form especially. So this is a mural from the tomb of Nebuchadnezzar. He was an Egyptian noble, and what we can see here is him participating in one of his favorite pastimes. So this would be echoing his life in the afterlife and everything like that. So we can see him hunting waterfowl. However, what's interesting about Egyptian painting is, as it refers to space and our recognition of space is that it's very formally, rigidly organized. So it doesn't begin to imply depth into space with foreshortening and things like that, where we're seeing things at really extreme angles going into space. Instead, it outlines everything in clear delineations and placements so that it doesn't get confusing, that we can still take away as much information as we can from it. And so what we see here is also what comes to be known as hierarchical scale. And we'll get into that a little bit more next time, or a little bit later on. But hierarchical scale refers to the height of an individual or an object being a reference to its importance. So in this particular case, Nebuchadnezzar, whose tomb this belongs to, is the most important individual. So he is actually depicted the largest here. But interestingly, even though his wife over here on the right is depicted just somewhat smaller, it starts to imply the idea that she's actually situated behind him somewhat. And likewise, their child down here being much smaller, once again, it gives the idea that she's situated back behind Nebuchadnezzar there. So it starts to take on a very kind of interesting quality, and this is something that will be, gradually refined throughout ancient Greco-Roman times into the Renaissance, where we start to get very illusionistic representations of realistic, naturalistic space within two-dimensional art forms. Now, as I said, almost any work of art on the picture plane begins to imply depth into the third dimension. And implied space can be identified by things like overlapping or diminishing size, vertical placement, or some combination of these elements. So if we look at an example here we can see overlapping and diminishing size, which is when the immediate assumption that one object in front of another distant object appears larger than those that are far away in our perception. So here we have a nice example. Now, obviously, in real life, every one of these columns in this photograph are the exact same size. They're the exact same placement away from one another. However, as the space begins to recede away from us, we start to see less and less of each one until in the back we can barely even make it out at all. But once again, this is an illusion created by our perception as our brains reinterpret the information that our eyes see. And it begins to imply this, kind of foreshortening and this idea that these things begin to recede away from us. And so this is something many artists have tried to emulate in their artwork over time. Likewise, we also have vertical placement, which is when objects placed low on the picture plane begin to appear closer to us as the viewer. Because we as the viewer are occupying the space right in front of the picture plane. And so, in this painting, Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth, we can see the figure of Christina here is much lower on the plane, so she appears as though she's standing not too far away from us, the viewer. Whereas the house up here, very tall on the picture plane, but also has that diminishing size, which makes it appear like it's further away from us. Now, obviously, Christina and the house are on the exact same level on the flat picture surface. However, it's these changes in proportion and their orientation that begin to imply the illusion of spatial depth within this picture plane as well. So kind of interesting there. Now, a lot of this starts to get into the whole idea of perspective. And perspective is a point of view or the means of representing 3D space or objects in two-dimensional space. So, there are many kinds of perspective, and we'll see some examples, but the most basic form of perspective is linear perspective, or a process which is a process developed during the Italian Renaissance to depict the way objects in space appear to the eye. So this would be a way of recreating that colonnade picture that we saw a minute ago within a two-dimensional picture plane. So objects appear smaller at distance and parallel lines seem to converge. This is the major principle upon which linear perspective works. So, But in order to make linear perspective work, we have to, see or at least utilize a couple other elements. So these would be things like our vanishing point, which is the point where parallel lines optically converge on one another at the horizon. And this is opposed to, say, the horizon line, which is the place where Earth and sky appear to meet, which is necessary to create linear perspective. So without a horizon line, we can't make linear perspective. However, we also have our eye level, and this is an imaginary plane, the height of the artist's eye, parallel with the ground plane and extending toward the horizon, where the eye level and the ground plane appear to converge. And it's important to note that our eye level is always going to be different because all of us are different heights and things like that. However, our eye level is almost always going to be exactly the same as the horizon line, just from our personal perspective. Now, aside from that, we also have the vantage point, and that is the fixed position or viewpoint. So that would be the view from which we, the viewer, are looking and creating that object or that, representation. And so the viewpoint also tends to go in line with eye level, the vanishing point, the horizon, all of this. So all of these things tend to go hand in hand. Now, when we utilize these, we can utilize them in a few different ways. So our most basic form is one-point perspective. And that is perspective where all parallel lines appear to converge on a single point, such as the diagram we see here. So we could see that our vantage point would be from wherever you're viewing it at. Same thing with your eye level. And the eye level would be the same as the horizon line, which cuts through at the back here. And then we have our vanishing point. And this would be where all of those parallel lines appear to converge. And so by creating parallel lines off of that and then cordoning them off, as we see here, we can create the illusion of a three-dimensional object within a two-dimensional surface. And so this is fairly rudimentary in artwork. One point perspective is most utilized to represent architectural forms and things like that. But it's usually not used wholeheartedly. It's usually used, there's a different kind of perspective used most of the time. However, we can see some nice examples of one-point perspective in artworks such as Raphael's The School of Athens. And we'll talk a little bit more about the subject matter of this particular work a little bit later on. But if we look at all of the architectural elements within the painting up here in the semicircle, we can see that they all begin to converge optically at a point basically right here between the heads of Socrates and Aristotle. And then likewise, our horizon line basically cuts right across neck level with all of these standing figures in the background. And so once again, all of those lines converge, and it helps to create the idea that this space is receding back away from us. So we'll talk more about this particular painting a little bit later on, but just a nice example of a classic artwork that uses one-point perspective. Now that is opposed to, say, two-point perspective, which is going to be much more heavily utilized in artwork than one-point perspective. And this is a perspective where the viewpoint shifts and therefore multiple sets of parallel lines converge on multiple points. So such as we see here. So one-point perspective is usually really good for showing something just off of center, whereas two-point is used much more for showing things on a corner or something like that. But this is still almost always used to echo architecture within two-dimensional artworks and things like that. But it is also important to note that, once again, we have our vanishing points on either end of our horizon line here, but depending on where we go on that horizon line, it would look like we're situated on it, below, or above, etc., etc. Now, it's also important to note that many works of art will also utilize more than just the two. So each object might have its own two separate vanishing points as well, and we'll see an example of that. So we can see that in Gustave Caillebott's, Paris Street Rainy Day here. And so once again, it's really echoed in the idea of the architecture in the background. But if we were to draw parallel lines on all of these buildings, we could see that these two parallel lines, all the ones on this side of the building, converge on a point just off the edge of the canvas. and likewise, these guys would converge somewhere just off the edge over here. And vice versa, these guys are going to converge somewhere down just on the edge and down here just behind, say, the man's eyeball there. So once again, we can use multiple sets of 2 points to create much more, realistic or naturalistic illusions within the picture plane here. So, aside from 2-point perspective, there is also a 3-point perspective, which is used for doing really harsh angles, like we're trying to look up really sharply at something. But not a lot of artists use it very much. It's much more of an extreme kind of thing. However, aside from 1 and 2-point perspective, we also have what's known as atmospheric perspective, or aerial perspective as it's sometimes known. And this is a nonlinear means of giving the illusion of depth through changes in color, intensity, and detail. So if we were to go out on a bright sunshiny day and look out at the horizon line, we could perhaps see, downtown Fort Worth or downtown Dallas in the distance, but it's going to appear very tiny and very indistinct to us, and that's because of the atmosphere getting in between us and that. So we obviously know that those buildings are all very tall, very big. However, in our perception from a distance away, they're going to appear smaller and less distinct the further away they get from us. So this is a nice example of a photograph. So obviously the closer things are, the lower down they're going to be. Also the darker and more distinct they're going to be. Whereas the further something recedes away from us, it's going to get less distinct, it's going to get lighter in tone, and it's going to be higher on the picture plane. So atmospheric perspective is also used quite extensively with that vertical placement. But just to show an example of an artwork that deals with this, a lot of landscape artwork deals with atmospheric perspective quite extensively. So here we see Albert Bierstadt's Sierra Nevada. Now, it might be a little difficult to see, but, down in the foreground, down here on the bottom, we can see some little deers drinking from this lake. And then once again, as we recede back, we see these towering mountains that are illuminated by this nice sunshine coming through this kind of tempest storm cloud and all of this kind of stuff. But once again, more distinct, more detailed down here, less distinct, much lighter, much less detailed the further back it gets. So nice example there. Now, aside from that, our other major element is going to be time. And time is the 4th dimension in which events occur in the succession. So our environment encompasses time and space, and as such, our experience of time depends on movement throughout space and vice versa. So time is a tricky thing in art. It can be made perceptible through things like film, which can really play with our perception of time. But in general, it's very hard to perceive time in the short run. Obviously, time has passed since we started this, but it's very fleeting. It's only over long periods of time that we're able to really, recognize it. Think about, aging over multiple decades and things like that. So it can be very tricky to try to capture. Although, time is invisible, it can be made perceptible through art, and there are a variety of ways that we can go about doing that. However, it is still very difficult. So once again, time is a major element in things like film, video, and kinetic sculpture. Once again, in film, we can really play with our perception of time and, all of these kinds of things. But a really nice example of the progress of time in a 2-dimensional artwork comes from Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire. And this is a series of 5 paintings that kind of show a progression of time over several movements. So here we can see what's known as the savage state. So this would be, the state of nature. And we see little minimal kind of human presence throughout, but it's all very much these kind of, tribal wild men and things like that. However, if we move to the second piece, the Arcadian state, we can see that, civilization is beginning to advance a little bit. We have a kind of Stonehenge like, monument in the background. We can see, people starting to, think about things in different ways. So we have a little philosopher guy. We have people tending sheep and all kinds of stuff like that. And it's important to note that you might see the Arcadian state or something referred to as Arcadian, but elsewhere. And this is usually referring to a kind of pastoral scene, a kind of mythical time out of time, if you will, in which human beings are still at harmony with nature, even though we're beginning to master it, things like that. Now, if we move forward, though, we see the consummation, and so here we can see time is dramatically kind of shifted. And if you've noticed, the little rock up on our cliff face is the major recurring element in all of these paintings. But we've gone from this kind of, proto civilization to a very Greco-Roman like civilization, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also come to the destruction. And so we see, the fall of empire. We see that mountain in the background once again. We can see all this turmoil. And then furthermore, we can see, the desolation or the ruin of empire and things like that. And so this is an interesting series of paintings, because once again, it kind of echoes this idea of, human civilization and all of these things, but it makes perceptible time through a series of movements. And so it's important in that regard. However, there are other artists that deal with time in much different ways. So here we see an interesting work of conceptual art. This is by Felix Gonzalez Torres, and this is what's referred to as Untitled or Perfect Lovers. And the background to this, Felix Gonzalez Torres was is an artist from the homosexual community, but his lover died of AIDS in 1991 when this piece was created. And he created this work of art by placing two clocks next to each other, and one of the clocks is stopped at the exact time that his lover died, while the other one continues to go. And so here we can see them just before one of them was started. So they both started at the same time, and then one is perpetually going, and it will stop whenever Felix Gonzalez Torres dies himself. And so it's an interesting work of conceptual art dealing with loss and grief and, all of these kinds of things, but also our perception of time and how it affects us and other kinds of things like this. Now, many non-Western traditions view time as cyclical, whereas in the West, time tends to be viewed as linear. In the cyclical notion, time embodies these cycles of destruction and reconstruction. We'll see that quite a bit in things like Asian art and pre-Columbian, Mesoamerican artworks as well. But Western tradition dictates time as being linear and continuously moving forward versus continuously kind of regenerating and things like that. So in 2D works, time is often portrayed through things like vignettes or episodic motion. This would be like, our Courts of Empire paintings by Thomas Cole. But we can also have things like film media that can intermix time by manipulating things like past, present, and future. So think about something, like flashbacks or a montage within a film that kind of either speed up or alter time. We can also think about films that show historical time periods that play with our perception of that. We can even think about films like, Pulp Fiction, or any Quentin Tarantino movie where he's not following a linear kind of, series of events. Instead, it's kind of jumping back and forth and showing us different things at different times and everything like that. So, we can really create disjunction in the passage of clock time through mediums like film and things like that. So that's kind of an interesting quality of that. However, I do want to show a non-Western version of an artwork that deals with time. And so here we can see the Heiji Monogatari Amaki scroll. And this is a scroll made in 13th century Japan. And it's depicting a conflict between rival daimyos for the shogunate. So this is a time period where in Japan, where civil war is quite rife, you have all of these rival, daimyo or lords that are vying for power and trying to become the new shogun or kind of military leader of the country and things like that. And so here we can see a scene, well, it's actually two scenes on a scroll, and we would be meant to view them as a kind of movement or vignette. So we would see part of it, we would read some text, and we would see the rest. And so we're actually meant to travel throughout the scene itself, and each little kind of passage of it is meant to represent different aspects of the overall story related in the text that we see. So it's a kind of interesting way of going about this. I've also found that, a lot of these scroll type of paintings and the way they're meant to be read are a major historical influence on the contemporary, mediums of like manga and anime and things like that in Japan. So I've always found that to be interesting as well. Now, opposed to time, we also have implied motion, which can also begin to echo an idea of time as well. And so this gives life-like feeling to a work and is sometimes central to the essence of a work of art. So here we can see a work by Marcel Duchamp during his early Cubist phase, but we can see this is nude descending a staircase. And so we can see, the idea of fracturing our vantage point into multiple different aspects to create an almost like the blur of movement going past us very rapidly within this two-dimensional artwork. So this is one way in which a Western tradition might try to represent movement or time within a two-dimensional work of art, as opposed to our last example with the Japanese scroll there. Now, as opposed to time and motion, we also have light. And light is a major aspect of artwork. So our eyes themselves are light-seeing organs. Light itself is actually made up of all colors that combine in our perception to create white light and things like that. But light can be used, it can be directed, it can be reflected, refracted, diffracted, or diffused. And depending on which of these we're utilizing, it's going to create overall dramatically different lighting effects. And so it's going to give an overall different reading to a work of art or a subject of any kind based on how we're utilizing light in this way. So the source, color, intensity, and direction of light can greatly affect how things appear to us, such as this example here of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Now, on the left here, we can see how it's actually lit normally. So it's lit from above. It creates this very somber, kind of serene image. It definitely seems much more warm and inviting versus if we were to say down or uplight it from beneath, and it creates that kind of horror, telling ghost stories effect. But it looks much, much more ominous here than as opposed to here. And once again, this would be a basic example of how much lighting can affect a given subject. Now, aside from lighting, we can also talk about value, which is the relative lightness or darkness of a surface. And so here we can see a nice kind of, diagram of value. And so things tend to appear darker when they're placed next to a lighter object, and they appear lighter when they're placed next to a darker object. So it might be, not easy to see in this, but, the kind of gray bar that runs through the middle here is the exact dead center gray that we see here. However, it appears much lighter as we approach black and much darker as we approach white. And so this is a way that we can perceive value as a relationship. And so this is kind of an interesting phenomenon. So, even light colors like yellow can be made to appear much, much more bright by placing them next to a much darker kind of value range and things like this. But something else that we can talk about is implied light, and that is the perception of value as a relationship rather than an isolated form. So that would be in relation to this diagram here. Now, one way that artists have used light very extensively throughout history is through the use of what's known as chiaroscuro. And this is the suggestion of mass through the contrast of light and dark. And chiaroscuro literally means, light and dark. In Italian, chiaro means light and oscuro means dark. And so here we can see a nice example of that by Caravaggio. This is the calling of St. Matthew. So we can actually see Jesus over here calling on Matthew to come and join him. However, we can see that only the most important elements of the story have been highlighted with light. In fact, our light source isn't even located on the canvas. It's implied by this window that's just off of the surface of the picture. However, it's illuminating just the most important information. So we can see just a glimmer of light cast across the hand of Jesus and the side of his face there, and then illuminating the main subject of Matthew here in the center and everything like that. So this is something that artists definitely during the Baroque period onward begin to utilize quite extensively. And so once again, this is used to create dramatic emphasis within a work of art and all kinds of things like this. So that brings us to color. And color is an interesting phenomenon. It's a very psychological kind of phenomenon. And different colors can have different psychological effects on us. For instance, for all of you sports fans out there, a lot of professional teams will paint their opposing team locker room this very soft shade of pink because it's very somber. It makes you more subdued versus, say, a color like really bright, vibrant red or yellow, which is more energetic and gets you more pumped up. This is, in a subtle effort to kind of reduce the opposing team's willingness or ability to win, if you will. A lot of prisons do similar things with these soft pastel colors to help quell violence and things like that. But likewise, a lot of color has these kinds of psychological effects on us. So, for instance, blue is a very somber, very depressing kind of color. It's usually much more relaxing, things like that. Whereas red, energetic, things like this. A lot of this is also used in the psychology of advertising. So think about any fast food logo you've ever seen. I guarantee it's got red, yellow, or orange in it. And, no food logo is really going to have blue or green in them for the most part. Things like this. So it's an interesting aspect of color itself. Now, color is the effect on our eye of light waves of different wavelengths and frequencies, such as we see in the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon album cover here. But all light, all white light is made up of all color. It's just how we perceive those wavelengths of color, which allows us to see certain color. So, each wavelength of color travels at a different speed. So warm colors have longer, faster wavelengths. They reach us quicker. They're more energetic. Whereas, cool colors have shorter, slower wavelengths. So they tend to reach us much later. They're much more somber, much more serene, things like that. So it can have a very dramatic kind of effect on us. Now, when referring to light and color, we also have to talk about pigment. And so objects appear a certain color because of the way that pigments absorb light waves. So an object appears red because the pigment absorbs all red wavelengths and reflects everything else out. So when we see a color, we're actually seeing everything but that color, which is an interesting phenomenon, in my opinion. So for instance, if we were to look at, say, my tube of blue paint here, we're actually seeing all colors but blue are reflecting back out at us, and it causes us to see blue in our perception. However, the paint itself is absorbing all of those blue wavelengths, and so which is what makes it appear as though it's blue. So it's a kind of interesting phenomenon there. Now, aside from that, we can also refer to what's known as local color, and that is the color of an object that appears to our eyes. Black is an absorption of all color wavelengths, while white is the reflection of all color wavelengths. So black and white are not considered to be true colors. Black, white, and gray are seen to be achromatic, but they can influence colors themselves. And so in that sense, achromatic refers to a pigment that is without the properties of hue and often referred to as neutral. So black, white, and gray tend to be on the neutral scale. And once again, if we interact those neutrals or achromatic colors with chromatic or local colors, then it can also enhance or change our perception of those colors as well. So obviously we have cool hues and warm hues. So cool hue refers to any color between green and violet on the color wheel. And warm hues likewise between red, violet, and yellow there. So pretty basic, pretty standard there. But every visible color is distinguished by several variables. So our first variable would be hue, and that is a particular wavelength of spectral color to which we give a name, or the colors of the spectrum. So red, yellow, green, blue, orange, all of those. Whereas a value refers to the relative lightness or darkness from white to black. So pure hues vary in value, with yellow being the lightest and violet being the darkest. But if we then add other things to them, we can also increase the value range of a color as well. So if we shade a color or a hue, we would be adding black to a hue. So adding black to a hue gives us a shade, and adding white to a hue gives us a tint. So if we look at this diagram, we can see our local color or our pure hue here on the outside. So that would be yellow, yellow, green, green, blue, all of that. Then if we add white to it and make a tint, we, have something more like this. If we tone it, we add gray to it, so we get something more like here. And then if we shade it, we add black and we get something more like the center. So we can have quite a variance across a pure hue, depending on how we tint or tone or add neutrals to it and all kinds of things like this. Now, this really gets into what's known as intensity and saturation, and this refers to the purity of a hue or color. So a pure hue being the most intense form of a given color at its highest saturation. So here we can see the pure hue of yellow at its most intense saturation. But if we add neutral, mid-tone gray to it, then we get a much less intense yellow, and it's almost even going into the realm of green almost. So once again, depending on how we tint, tone, or shade, we can dramatically alter the intensity or saturation of a pure hue or color. Now, aside from that, we can also do a variety of different color mixes. So the first would be a subtractive color mixture, and this is when pigment mixtures where reflective light is gradually eliminated. So here we can see subtractive color on the right. So this would be like if we were to mix paint together. If we mix, yellow and blue, we get green. Blue and red, we get violet, and, et cetera, et cetera. But if we mix all of those together, we'll end up getting black. So that would be a subtractive color mixture. So that would be like physically mixing paint together. Whereas an additive color mixture is when the light primaries of red, orange, green, and blue, violet combine to create white light, such as we see on the left here. And this is actually how a lot of our technology works, including LED TVs, the computer screen here, anything like that, your phone screen, all works through this additive color mixture. If you remember the old school tube televisions, you could get up really close and you'd see these little, lines of red, green, and blue, and how they were reflecting these different colored lights at the same time would create the image on the television and all of this kind of stuff. That's a little bit old school, but LEDs and, plasma screens, it all works on the same principle. Now, aside from that, we also have a variety of different kinds of hues. So first and foremost, we have primary hues. These are red, yellow, and blue, and these are hues that cannot be produced through the intermixing of other hues. So no matter what you do, there's nothing you can do, no two colors you can mix together to make yellow, blue, or red. They have to exist on their own. But from these three, we can make an infinite variety of colors. And so, first and foremost, if we mix two primaries together, we then get a secondary hue, and those would be things like orange, green, and violet, or the mixture of two primary hues. But if we then also mix a primary and secondary hue together, we get what are known as tertiary hues. And these would be things like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, red, violet, etc., etc. So once again, it's a mixture of a primary and a secondary hue to make a tertiary. So pretty basic. However, an interesting phenomenon that we can also use in color mixing is optical blending. And this would be, or is referred to as broken or pure hues that mix in our perception through vision. So obviously we can see an image here of the Mona Lisa depicted with just colored dots. And this is the same way, or the same thing that Monet was doing with his grain stack paintings that we saw last time. But this is also how offset printing works. So if you've ever seen a photograph reproduced in like a magazine or a newspaper or something like that, it's probably done in this same manner. So it's actually an illusion of blending in our perception where our mind and our eye kind of fills in the gaps. So it's an interesting phenomenon there as well. But there are artists that deal with this idea of optical blending. This is one of my personal favorite artists, Chuck Close. And he's interesting because he begins his career as a hyper-realist. He would do these large-scale paintings that looked like photographs and crazy kinds of things. But he suffered a spinal injury that left him paralyzed from the chest down. And so he couldn't really paint that way anymore, but he started to come up with this optical blending style or technique. So what he does is he grids off a canvas and then he starts to paint in colored circles inside of that grid. And he does it in such a way that the color begins to imply a recognizable image. But if we got really close up to one of these, we would just see a bunch of colored splotches and squiggles and things. But then when we step away from it, we can start to see a recognizable image in it. I've always thought his work was really interesting in that regard. Now, aside from color and our perception of it, we can also talk about texture. And so texture refers to the tactile qualities of a surface or the visual representation of those qualities. And so here we can see, some very rough ground. Obviously, everything's going to have different texture. The screen here, very smooth, whereas, say, the drywall behind me, is, got that kind of subtle texture to it and everything like that. But there are different ways that artists go about using texture. So we have things like actual texture, which is a texture that can be seen or felt. And so here we can see an example of such. This is Marie Oppenheim's object Paris. And this is a saucer, teacup, and spoon that have literally been covered in animal hair. And so, it creates this kind of, obscure or, weird object that's unusable and everything. But if we were there, we could touch it. We could feel the texture of that hair. We can see it, obviously, all kinds of things like that. It is an actual texture that we could touch or feel or anything like that. However, we can also use implied textures. And this is something done in a lot of artwork in the past. And this is when a texture is created to appear as something other than paint on a flat surface, etc. So a lot of still life artists of the past are very masterful at this. Here we can see William Call's still life. This would also be a kind of Vanitas still life, if you will. But if we look in the back or at this, we can see a variety of different textures across these different objects. So we can see perhaps the smoothness of the silver there versus the kind of raised quality of this picture in the background. And if we look at a little bit of a close-up, we can see, especially on that background, he's using just little dots of paint to create the implied surface quality of that raised surface on the vase and everything like that. So it's kind of interesting. But once again, if we were actually there looking at this painting in person, it would appear as though it's just a flat surface. It's only that, when we step back from it, that it begins to imply that. However, artists can also use an actual physical texture in association with an illusionistic representation like this as well. But that's what comes to be known as impasto. And impasto refers to the thick application of brushstrokes of paint, giving tactility to the flat surface. And this is something that is done in the past. It's usually done to echo the illusion of depth. A lot of the times, like in seascapes and things like that, the surface might be very smooth and pristine, but the little crests of waves have a little bit of texture to them, which makes them come off the canvas a little bit. But beginning in the 19th century, when artists really began to challenge how to actually paint, and what is acceptable in painting, we start to see impasto become much more prevalent. And the Impressionists are really, really masterful at the use of impasto. And here we can see an example of a Van Gogh painting, and Van Gogh is probably the most well-known impasto artist. Almost all of his work has very heavy use of impasto. So if we actually zoom in at a little section of the cypress bush down here, we can see some of that texture. So we can actually see the physicality of his paint and the stroke of his paint. It sticks off that canvas. It creates shadow. And so once again, this creates an overall different feeling for us as the viewer when we look at this work of art, because we perhaps might not see it the same way every time based on how the lighting is and all kinds of things like that. And so once again, this is something that can also be used to create certain illusions within the picture plane and all kinds of stuff like this. So that is the end of the visual elements. And next time we'll look at the principles of design. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.